Well, thanks everyone for attending. Thanks for taking the time out. I'll just move my screen there a little bit. I know you've got very busy schedules, and we really do appreciate it. Just to let you know that we're recording this session, so afterwards what we'll do is I'll send out to everyone a copy of this presentation as well as the recording and the chat as well. During the presentation by Helen, if you want to put any comments in or questions, Tabitha's monitoring those as well, so pop in messages in the chat. Also, if you have a question, of course, you can unmute and ask any questions as we go along as well. So I just want to go through running order. First, we'll go off with the introductions. Then Helen will be talking about a short background as why a survey professional staff, to give some context before we start looking at the wider picture. Then we'll be looking at key questions in consideration. So I circulated some notes from Helen, just some thought generators, some ideas about things to explore further. Then we'll be moving on to the survey questions. We sent the surveys out to you. I know some people weren't able to attend, so they've actually sent us comments in advance, but we can go through the questions. And then a roundup and some final thoughts at the end. So it's quite a bit to do in a short space of time. So before we start, it'd be really useful in the chat box if you could tell us who you are and why you're interested specifically in the professional staff survey. So yeah, you should all be able to locate the chat in there. There should be a chat button there. So if you want to pop some messages in there. Hi, Rob. Okay, what we'll do is if you can put the messages in, what I'll do is I will hand over to Helen Beaton. She's our external consultant who will be leading on building the survey, and also assisted by Tabitha, who is an external consultant as well, who will be monitoring the chat, and she is also helping with the survey design as well. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, divisions of labour between myself and Tabitha are, very evenly spread, but in this case, she's definitely going to be building the survey. It's my job to really think about this larger picture of why people want to run the insights surveys and what the professional services survey might add to that sort of suite of tools that are there already. So I thought I'd start by doing an overview. I can see lots of people who are here run at least one of the insights surveys, which may well be the student one. That's been going for 3 years and more now, and has had quite a long history of development, and some of you have been involved in that, so it's great to see you here. We also have, as of last year, a teaching staff survey, and there were some very particular reasons we wanted to involve teaching staff, but having involved teaching staff, then we have had requests to involve other staff as well, and I think we will just go through the background to that and then really try and unpick and think about what that very large range and variety of staff are bringing to the table, if you like, what we're taking to them, but what they're bringing to the insights process, and how best to involve them. So, thinking about the overall rationale for developing and running the insights service. This is very much the top level agenda for institutions, as we know, because we evaluate it and regularly talk to people like yourselves, is firstly about understanding how staff and students are using the digital environment. Given that institutions are investing in the digital environment, they want to know that investment is worth making and how it's being used, particularly for the core businesses of colleges and universities, which is learning and teaching, and then also, in the case of universities, research and public engagement as well. The digital experience of students has always been in the centre of what we did, although there is room, I think, to broaden that if we start including other groups of staff and to support capacity building among staff.
Apologies.
So that could be staff of all kinds. It could be teaching staff, it could be other staff who have a student-facing role. It could be professional staff who are building the organisation rather than specifically working with students or supporting students' digital capabilities or whatever. We know that institutions really like the benchmarking offer within the survey process, and the local kind of capacity to develop local messages. Sometimes they can be used to create cases for investment of certain kinds, to create strategic pressure to do certain things, which a lot of people find useful. And that, in a way, was more primary than the JISC national level kind of analysis. But some of you will know that JISC has done that analysis of findings at a national level, partly because the response to insights has been large and almost overwhelming. There's been a large volume of data there, and it's sort of seemed obvious that we would want to make some use of that and to understand our sectors, FE and HE, and the student experience in them more completely, having access to all that great data. So there's a number of reasons for running and developing insights, and some of them lend themselves really well to a professional services kind of engagement and staff survey, and others, particularly I guess the centrality of the student experience, might make you begin to sort of say, okay, we need to just see exactly how the professional staff are bringing a new perspective and a new information to this. So if we move on to the next slide, Mark, thank you. Most of you will know, but I'll just remind you that what the service actually is primarily a number of surveys. The student and the teaching staff survey we've spoken about, the professional staff survey we're here to talk about, and there's a strong likelihood there will be a researcher survey for universities to run, which could be taken by academic staff who perceive their role primarily as research, or could be taken by research students or by early career researchers or research active or fixed term research staff. So there's a possibility of finding out from a range of stakeholders what the digital experience in that organisation is like. The surveys are, tried and tested. They mainly involve closed questions that we can benchmark across institutions and that we can collate nationally to give a broader picture. They also include open questions, which are mainly to be used locally, because that rich data is often concerns particularly local issues, and a lot of people find that really useful. But we can also support customised questions, further questions to be added. In the teaching staff and student surveys, an important customizable question asks about the subject area that teaching staff or students are mainly based in. And we give organisations the opportunity to write that question, essentially, because every organisation divides that landscape up differently. And it's really important to say that we see professional services staff as being equally diverse, and every institution has its own way of describing those different roles and the different parts of the institution they sit in. So we feel very clear that that has to be a customisable question in exactly the same way. So we're not expecting that we will be able to devise a question which accurately for each organisation allows them to see where each member of staff who's responding to the survey might sit in their organisational structure. But we might also, in addition to that, feel it's worth partitioning this very broad swathe of professional services staff for our purposes in order to ask them slightly different questions. And that's a question that I'll come back to. But important to know that that one of the customisable questions will certainly be a partitioning question. And there's room to ask quite a lot of other customisable questions. Those of you who've used the actual authoring interface will know that we can write a customisable question that makes it very easy for the author to make any changes they want. So, for example, we could write a customizable question which has a long list of institutional systems that can be either added to or deleted from, or where you could change the sort of generic title of that system, like student record system, to be the actual name of the system as it is used in that organisation, so as staff will understand it. So it's important to think about the customisable section of the survey, not as a blank space, but as a space in which we could give quite strong steer as to the kind of questions to put there, but still leave it to institutions to make some changes. It would obviously mean we couldn't benchmark those particular questions, but it would mean that we could make the questions and the partitioning of respondents very locally specific. So sorry to dwell on that, but just an important thing to realise. So apart from the surveys, we have very detailed guidance about how to engage different staff and students. about how to customize and deliver and so on, and how, of course, very importantly, how to analyze the findings that come out of the survey and what kind of actions you might take for change. And to support particularly those last two, we now have a community of practice where people who are running insight surveys can get together, share their experience of analysis and of what happens next, maybe practical implementation issues, but also larger issues about organisational change can be shared there, and that's a very lively community. So before I move on to think about these questions and maybe talk through the diagram a little bit, I just wondered if there's any points people wanted to make in the message box about anything I've said, or any questions before we move on. It's great to have Sarah with us, and thank you, Sarah. Sarah can also answer some questions since she's here. Okay, so no pressing questions coming up, but please just type away as we go. So what the diagram to the right of your screen shows here is the way in which the student and teaching staff insight surveys related to one another. And you know, we were talking very much about the student experience at the start of this project, and it still remains very dear to our hearts as the kind of driving kind of rationale, I guess. Teaching staff relate to the student experience in the same, essentially in all of them in the same way. They might teach in different ways or different subjects, but essentially they have the same relationship to the student experience. So when we were asking teaching staff questions about their teaching, we could ask questions that really corresponded quite closely to the questions we were asking students about their learning. So the two surveys were designed to be, in some senses, and particularly in that top piece, the you and your digital and digital at your institutions, to ask very, very similar questions about the learning about the digital environment that learners and separately teachers were creating for themselves, creating out of organisational offer and out of their own technology. And then we could ask them questions about how well that environment worked for them. So how well they felt supported in the thing they had to do, whether it was teaching or learning, by the digital environment as offered by the organisation and as provided by themselves through their personal technology. So there's a very clear, it's very clearly, in a sense, you could imagine adding together those two things as an organisation to get a big picture of how people who are using our organisation's digital environment are using it, how well they're finding it meets their needs. And then at the bottom part of the survey, there were questions about learning and about teaching that, rather than being added together, were two separate perspectives on essentially the same thing. So, for example, those of you who've used the survey will know that we asked learners how often they do certain things on their course. And we could ask teachers how often they did certain things and have a look and see if those things matched up well. And we could ask learners how well supported they felt in developing their digital skills. And we could ask teaching staff not the same question, but how much support they had for developing the digital aspects of their teaching professional capacity. So we were able to look at the student learning experience through the direct lens of the student learning experience, and then through this other lens of the experience of teaching staff and how well supported they felt they were to address particular issues for students. So there was a sense in which those two surveys were looking at each other in a very nice way. I'm not suggesting that designing them was straightforward or we got it right first time. It was a lot of development work, but I think there was a coherence to the data and the story we're trying to tell. And I mean, Tabitha could say more about this, but what that meant, for example, was we were able to pull out, by comparing directly students and teachers at the same organisations who did both, we were able to say some really interesting things like, for example, you may remember if you saw our presentations, students on the whole are less dissatisfied or more inclined to be satisfied with the digital environment than teaching staff. You know, teaching staff, or put it another way, have higher aspirations for the digital environment for learning. You know, students are, you know, inclined to say that they like the amount of digital they get in their learning, whereas teaching staff are inclined to say at the same institution they would like technology used more. And because those questions were looking at each other so closely, we were able to do some of that. So that's just to give you some background for thinking about how a professional services angle might, on the one hand, be a bit the same. So we could use quite a lot of what we learned from the teaching staff survey, but also a little bit different. And if there's no direct questions, which I don't see, Mark, if that's okay to move on, I'm going to move on to talking about so the new survey is constructed from the teaching staff survey, essentially, as you would expect. So we've taken the same approach, which in turn was constructed out of the student survey. So at the top of those two pieces, you and your digital technology and the organisational technology, digital infrastructure, the name is slightly in transit across all the surveys, but essentially we're talking about the same two things there, asking people about their personal use and their personal technologies, and asking them about how they experience the organisational technologies. And that's a kind of easy crossover to make in most respects. We'll look at how it isn't. When we get to the bottom part, the teaching staff, we were asking them very specifically about their role as teachers. When it comes to professional staff, there are a whole number of roles packed up into that pink corner. So we can still ask them about their professional development. We can still expect that organisations will attend to the professional development of librarians, career advisors, learning resource advisors, IT support staff, and the rest of it. But the way that they enact their role might be very different. And so that pink bit down in the bottom left-hand corner is something we might need to think about quite carefully in terms of how we construct a survey that isn't just asking about the digital environment, that is actually asking professionals to reflect on their digital professionalism and the nature of their role in an educational organisation, because that's our kind of unique selling point, if you like. So if we move on to the three things we need to think about, there's the number of things we need to think about. As we've said, professional staff have a wider range of roles, and some of those roles are directly student facing, but some are staff facing. They might work in HR, they might work in, for example, roles around the curriculum. They might be doing quality assurance in the curriculum. They might work in registry. Some of them will be systems facing, so they might be working as IT support or e-learning staff on those digital systems that everybody else who does these surveys is sort of evaluating, if you like. And some will have broader organisational roles and administrative and managerial roles. And in a sense, if all we're talking about is the digital environment, that's fine. We can accomplish all of that. If we decide we want to ask some questions about how they relate to students, the curriculum and the digital environment specifically, and therefore how they provide the organisation with digital capacity, then we might need to think about breaking them down. And I don't mean breaking them down in the way that each organisation breaks them down. I mean breaking them down in a way that makes sense across all the organisations we survey, so that we can ask some sensible questions, for example, of staff who seem to be in a broadly library-based role, or staff who seem to be broadly in an IT support role. And so we need to think about, is that worth doing? It will be complex. And if it's worth doing, clearly we can't pull out every single one of those roles, certainly not at this pilot stage. So which are the 2 or 3 that it's really worth pulling out? And then, having said that the digital environment is slightly more straightforward than their digital role, on the other hand, we were able with the teaching and learning survey to really focus on the virtual learning environment, because that was the one system with its attendant functions, and it's not a simple system, but essentially we were talking about the experience of teaching or the experience of learning. So that was the system that we needed to ask about. If we think about this very broad range of professional services staff, they're going to be using a lot of different systems. And again, we need to decide, do we just not ask in the benchmarked area about those systems? That certainly leaves the opportunity for organisations to ask about all those systems, or do we think that there are some of those digital systems that we really do need to ask about across the piece, and therefore we need to decide, 1, which ones they are, and 2, how we talk about them in ways that will be recognised in every university or college that wants to do the survey. And I've got a sort of it's related but not quite the same question, which is, given that some of the people who fall into this professional services category will be the people who are actually running the Insights survey service, or have historically done that. They may be people who are directly responsible for the student digital experience, or indirectly responsible for it, for example, by supporting digital systems, by offering IT support, by developing students' digital skills, by doing academic digital staff development around digital issues, for example. So those staff will on the one hand, have very detailed things they might say, particularly in open questions, and that we might feel we really, really want to capture those detailed and expert thoughts they have about how to make things better. We don't want to miss that. On the other hand, you wouldn't have to be too cynical to say that it may not be appropriate to mix in their evaluations of, let's say, the digital environment with the evaluations of naive end users who have no responsibility for it. It might not be appropriate. You know, on the one hand, they may be more critical. They may be inclined to be more critical because they know more in more detail how it works and fails to work and what regularly goes wrong with it. Or they may be inclined to be less critical because they may feel, oh, you know, hang on, we may be judged by the outcome of this survey. And either way, whether you feel cynical or not about that, we would ideally not want to mix up their assessments of the digital environment with assessments of naive end users who simply experience it as end users. So it's a slightly different question about partitioning, but it's a question about making sure that the credibility of the findings are not compromised by people saying, oh, but hang on, you know, 30% of the people who answered this survey in our institution happen to be from IT support. Can we rely on what they had to say about the quality of Wi-Fi? You know, or, you know, how reliable is it? So, Rob, if we move us on, Mark, sorry, if we move us on. Yeah, just this thing that Tabitha maybe can say a little more about as kind of building and being mainly responsible for the user experience. But, you know, the things that we've really tried to take account of when we built this survey, comparability with the other surveys. It's not just to make our lives easier. It's because users really want to be able to compare the questions as directly as possible. And to say, you know, if teachers are saying this, what are students saying about the same thing? What are all of our staff saying about the quality of Wi-Fi? Is there a reason why professional staff experience it differently? We want questions that are actually going to be relevant and valuable. And I think with the professional survey, I'm particularly concerned that professional staff don't feel that their particular role and contribution hasn't been acknowledged when they do this survey, that they feel, well, I don't quite know why, as a librarian, I was being asked those questions. It didn't feel highly relevant to me. We're going to struggle to make it very relevant to everybody, but we might need to think about whether we ask, again, this question about whether we ask slightly different questions of different people. The overall user experience and question flow and screen design and length of survey, which is Tabitha's absolutely expert area, you know, we need to think about that as well. You know, we could design something that conceptually works, but in fact, as an end user, you experience it as a bit clunky and disjointed because of how we've answered some of the other problems and questions behind the scene. And of course, the most important thing is that in the end, it's worth doing. We don't want to take up your time, our time, all our respondents' time to produce findings that it turns out are not all that useful. And I am quite mindful of you know, the fact that institutions run surveys of their own, and professional staff are often members of professional associations that run surveys. ALT and UCISA would be among them in this space. And so we've got to be really sure that what we're asking is unique, it's uniquely valuable, and it works alongside those other sources of data. It doesn't try to replicate them. So we come to the questions that we wanted you to think about in advance. What I'll do is I'll just go through them. I probably won't say too much more. I'll give other people the opportunity to jump in. And then if it's okay with you, we'll look at them one at a time for a couple of minutes each. And then we'll come back to looking at the actual questions, having gone this. If it feels a roundabout route, I apologise, but we really wanted to share our thinking with you and not just present you with the end result, because, you know, then, you know, it wouldn't be fair in a sense, because you wouldn't know how we'd arrived at what was in front of you. So I think the first and most important question is to ask, what information and new perspectives are professional staff going to bring to this process? We don't just want to ask them questions because they're there and because we feel that we should. We want to ask them questions because they have a perspective to offer, and because their contribution to the digital organisation is important and is valuable, and because their experience of the digital environment really matters and has knock-on effects for teaching staff, for students, for researchers, for the core business of the organisation. We need to think about whether we ask staff in different services or different kinds of service. We might group services together, perhaps. We need to ask them different questions. For example, whether they are a categorization that I might be, but obviously there are others. Do they have direct relationships with students? So we need to think about them as providing services for students. Do they have relationships with staff? Do they work with systems? These might be, but there might be other ways of classifying them. So this is a question, and I've just reminded all of us that there is going to be a customizable question which allows each institution to categorize staff in their own way. So we're not thinking about that question, so if whatever they're called in your organization, you can ask staff as they complete the survey, which department are you in, and give them a list of departments that make sense to you. We're not asking that question. It's more how we division up these staff, if we do, to ask them slightly different questions about the responsibilities they have to other parts of the digital organisation. I think a simple answer to that knot of problems is not to ask very much at all about different professional roles. And I think we've seen some examples of professional staff surveys that have focused very much on the digital environment and digital systems and how professional staff experience those systems and their professional development around them. And we may decide that's a really valuable thing in and of itself to do. What we don't do then is to acknowledge that some of the things those professional staff do have particular resonance value for the digital organisation. I'm thinking of all the staff in different roles that are taking, for example, in careers that are taking on responsibility for data of various kinds. That has very particular value to the organisation. Maybe we want in our survey to try and surface some of those changes in professional roles and ensure that organisations actually notice and support and value them. And we can't do that if all we ask about is what systems do you use and how do you experience those systems. So that would be a risk of going down the easier route and not asking those role-related questions. And again, the same question, how do we take account of the many different systems in use? At the moment, the version that you've seen, we've made a kind of compromise, which is to ask about a long list of systems, but not to ask very much about each of them, unlike in the case of the VLE, where we ask quite detailed questions about it. Is that worth doing, or should we decide that is or isn't worth doing and put it into the customizable part? Is that data collected locally anyway? So it's simply duplicating something that's already known about on the ground. This is where we need your expertise, or really is this not a question that's being asked? And so it becomes really important that our survey asks it. I'm going to pause because I've gone on and on for a while, and I can see that there's some really great comments on all of those already, which we're capturing. If it's okay with everyone here, let's go through. I'm going to stop talking and we'll put up these questions one at a time and invite any comments on it. And I'll also, Mark, if you're happy to control this, invite people if they want to speak to just put their hands up and speak if that's easier than typing. And I think that's my mic and hand over.
I haven't used the putting hand up, so if anyone just wants to unmute and speak, then go ahead.
I also just start something off then. I mean, I think in terms of what new perspectives, I think what we are trying to get a better and a richer picture of is, at the end of the day, the digital environment that our staff and students are sort of working within. And I think we're already starting to see there's such benefits in being able to look at the student views as opposed to teaching staff views. But then I think, again, bringing in an audience who are still involved and have a role in supporting the core business of the university, which is impacting on the student experience, I think will give us that richer picture. Particularly, I think, in the areas around, one of the areas I think that's come through quite strongly in terms of an indicator is around sort of digital skills, digital confidence, looking at some of the legal requirements that relate to technology use, like accessibility, inclusion, and data protection, well-being. So I think it'll be really fascinating to see how we can start to build up this really sound sort of knowledge base in relation to how, you know, all users are experiencing the environment that they are working within. Particularly, I think, again, thinking about the evidence that it then feeds back into the institution, and thinking about how that then relates back to the investment that is being made in these different areas as well.
Hi there, it's Rob Howe from Northampton. So with regards to this question, I mean, I was thinking about it as a hierarchy of support. So at the top really, you've got the students themselves, and then obviously below that you've got the tutors, and then sort of in parallel you've obviously got professional support staff. Professional support staff support the students directly, but they also support the academic staff to support the students. So for the student-facing professional support staff, their digital competence directly impacts on the student, both directly and also indirectly through the academics themselves. And Sarah was actually at Northampton yesterday, and we were chatting about how the competence of both the academics and potentially the professional support staff below them, all of those are impacting on the student experience, because if academics get bad advice from professional support staff, student-facing support staff, then student experience is compromised. And likewise, if the professional support staff that are directly student-facing don't have digital competence, then they directly impact student experience. So if you've got people that are on the IT support desk that don't have the full range of skills, for example, when students go up to them and ask for help and advice, sometimes they just can't even answer some of the basic questions because they don't have the range of digital skills that are actually needed. So just a few thoughts there really from my side.
I think that's interesting, Rob, because having visited you yesterday and seeing the new environment that you're working within, what struck me was that there was a far more of a blurring of roles, particularly if we are thinking of some of those student-facing staff and academic staff. They're all working in this sort of a similar space. They are working with students. They are supporting them in the development of their digital skills. And I think that's where some of the boundaries now are sort of blurring more than have been in the past, due to the environments that staff now are finding themselves in, and the slightly different roles that they're working with as well.
And certainly it was quite interesting at Northampton. One of the things that we didn't mention, Sarah, yesterday was the arguments that IT had with some of the student-facing desks. Basically, IT were trying to get the student-facing desk to take on full responsibility for supporting the students and to answer all of the various IT questions. And there was very much a pushback from the IT student desk saying that they didn't have the range of skills needed to be able to support the students in that particular way. So that was quite an interesting discussion, and actually relevant to this survey as well.
Yeah.
One of the things that certainly talking to, if we could use the term student facing, and I'm really relieved that some of these terms are going down okay. If we could look across the piece at student facing staff, whether they're IT support or library support or career support or disability assist or whatever those staff are called, one of the things they have in common is they're increasingly expected to support service users without meeting them face to face. And so I think there's a whole category of questions we can ask about providing support to students in a digital organisation that are actually quite deep questions about the kinds of expertise that those staff need to be developing, which are not role specific in the narrow sense, but are specific to student facing roles. So it's useful to think that through. So yes, sorry Marika, we were deliberately trying to get you to focus on one question at a time, but you're talking about all of them, which I predicted you would do, so it's probably more useful just to keep all of them up there and dip about within them, because they are all related.
Certainly a lot of the collaborative synchronous technologies, Blackboard Collaborate, WebEx, and the stuff that we've got at the moment that we're using, it's interesting because we've got more and more front-facing people that are using this type of tech, and they've been relying more now on learning technology to try and get the skills that are actually needed. And it's quite interesting because some of our surveys are particularly looking at the competence levels in this type of environment, and it's still very varied, even though a lot of these front-facing people are expected to be quite familiar in Skype and so on to support students at a distance.
Well, and also, I've come across a lot of professional staff who are now expected to, for example, when the university kind of buys a system, purchases or develops a library system or a wide range of systems, that they're expected to write some of the contextual help that students or staff would see when they're using the system, and that's a very specialised and skilled. That's actually falling to professional staff such as library staff to do, and IT staff. And it's very specialised. Way of thinking about service provision to actually write contextualized help within a designed system, and yet I've come across lots of people expected to do that without any formal training in it. So there's it's not only supporting students, if I could put it in a similar way to how you might have supported them, but using Skype or video conferencing or even chat. It might actually be completely new approaches to actually having to attend to the UX of a service, for example, which is a completely new set of skills that professional services staff are being asked to apply.
There's something there, isn't there, Helen, that, we're moving, and I think this came up as well yesterday, Rob, that we're sort of moving from just the core competencies of using those technologies to more thinking about how I'm using them in my practice, in my role, to then actually thinking about, I'm actually not just using them, I'm confident and I can adapt and I can, if a new system comes along tomorrow that does the same thing, I've got that confidence and that I know how to use them. So, the systems and the environment is becoming more complex with a different range of technologies that may not necessarily have been core to that role previously, but are now having to be part of that role, as well as the complexity in what people are being asked to do with some of those systems in different contexts as well.
But we then also have within this some groups of professional staff that are very, very specifically involved, and so, for example, there are staff classified as professional staff, and it depends a little bit on what organisation it is, how they're classified, that are very involved in developing the digital curriculum, as either as e-learning staff or as educational or academic developers or as quality advisors, or indeed as curriculum leads that are non-teaching curriculum leads. I mean, there's a whole range of roles that might not, in some ways we might say, do we want to push those people towards doing the teaching staff survey and make sure the teaching staff survey takes a very broad view of what it means to be teaching? That might mean, doing some of these other roles which are not traditionally teaching but are very close to teaching as a profession. Or do we want to make a special space in the professional services survey to give those people an opportunity to say something about the changes, because the changes that they think are required, if we think of our kind of headline questions, what one thing should the organisation change to make this better, they are going to have some very nuanced and deeply embedded and expert things to say about that, and they're going to have some very clear views of what's going right and wrong, which we wouldn't want to miss. But at the same time, we might be in trouble if we mix those views in with the views of a whole load of other professional services staff who have nothing to do with that and are merely speculating, about what might be nice. Do you know what I mean? There's a lot of different levels of engagement that we might want to try to unpick, not at the, obviously not at an excruciating level of detail, but at some level of detail, just in order to do justice to the different perspectives there are.
Hi, Helen. Are you on mute there?
Deliberately so, but I can say something if you want me to. I was just watching. See what went past.
Okay. Any other comments?
I think there's a nice question there from Tabitha around, what issues are relevant enough for institutions to want to compare nationally. Really interested to hear people's thoughts around that, because I think obviously there are, you know, currently institutions that are running their own surveys, but, you know, what are those benefits of having that sort of national set of data, that benchmarking? Be good to get some thoughts around that.
Hi Sarah, it's Gillian here. That on the benchmarking is something that people often cite from the UCISA Digital Capabilities Survey, and just thinking of key examples that people have cited in the past where they've used it has been to benchmark themselves in terms of particularly like support, how many staff are supporting technologies, digital capabilities. So an institution could maybe use that to argue with their management to say, look, you know, that institution is the same size and they have X amount of staff, and or that the sectoral average is X and we only have so many. It's certainly one case that springs to mind. I'm trying to think if there's any more specifics, but I can't think off the top of my head. Let me come back to you.
Thanks, Gillian. I think certainly from our perspective, I think it's really helpful to have some of those national benchmarks and standards there, because so we have a role as GIST to make sure that we can lever support, you know, if there are big issues. I mean, for example, with our teaching staff survey, where we did the small pilot, what was really interesting there is some of the areas which were a little bit of a red flag, really, in relation to perhaps staff being aware of some of the new accessibility and inclusion legislation coming in, data protection, wellbeing. So those are really useful for us as sort of indicators that we can then you know, inform our work at GISC in terms of how we might be able to support institutions better. But also, in some respects, it's quite reassuring, you know, if there are sort of particular challenges that are coming up across you know, the sector. It's quite reassuring for institutions to think, well, it's not just us, you know, it is something that the sector as a whole is sort of grappling with. And that's, you know, helps us to sort of bargain together sort of more collective power in terms of how we try and solve some of these challenges. Yes, Marika, I think I definitely agree. It's something there over time I think is important. I think, you know, particularly in terms of where we are with TEL and, you know, the agenda that we have, I think to be able to show progress, to be able to sort of baseline where we're starting from and where we're moving towards on our journey, I think is also really important evidence. And I keep sort of going back to that word, sort of evidence, but I think that's becoming more increasingly important in the work that we do, that we are able to demonstrate impact and value, and that we have, you know, got evidence. You know, for example, I know for some of the student surveys, for example, some institutions are using that data to inform their TEF submissions. For colleges, it's also evidence that can be used back for Ofsted. So I think it is looking at how this data can really inform and support what you're doing at a local level as much as what we're doing at a national level.
I think it's related to the question about what do we benchmark nationally, or, you know, I mean, it doesn't have to be because it's benchmarkable, but what are questions that are relevant to everybody? And we have a role, you know, in producing a survey. We are not just providing a tool, but we're in a sense creating a message about what we think matters as GISC. So, you know, what are the issues that we think matter enough that it's worth asking everybody this question? And I think it's worth just considering that when respondents get to the part in the teacher survey that asks about the professional development they've had and how rewarded and recognised they feel and what support they feel they've had for, it's something like the digital aspects of your role. I mean, Tabitha can correct me. They know what we mean by the digital aspects of your role because we've just asked them a load of questions about teaching and learning. So about teaching. So it's clear we don't just mean, can you log on to the BLE and upload something? It's very clear we mean, as a digital teacher, what support are you getting? So I think it's relevant to ask when we get our professional services staff to that part of the survey where we say, what support have you had for the digital aspects of your role? Are we happy that they should just think we mean, can I use the systems I'm required to use? Or do we want to have taken them through some other questions which strongly imply that we think they're doing some things that have value in terms of how they're using those systems to change the student experience, to better support the curriculum design process, or whatever it might be. If they're librarians, to provide service at a digital level. Are we happy that when we get to that question, that all we can really ask about when we say, are you being developed, is to use our digital systems? Or do we want that to mean something different? Do we want this phrase digital professional to mean something other than just being a proficient user of digital systems? Now, if the answer to this, that is, we do want it to mean something else, that's what we have to articulate at this meeting. What is it that being a good digital professional in an education organisation means that is over and above just using digital systems proficiently? And if we decide we can't ask about that because it's just too various, I'm happy and we'll go away and we'll build the thing. But if we think there is something, and it might be around this thing about providing digital services to digital end users, it might be around, well, what else would it be around? I mean, what other things could we ask about that would fit into that slot? If we can't think of anything, that's fine. Our job is clear and really quite simple.
Your job is never simple, Helen.
Well, we work quite hard to make it complicated, but we're equally happy to be told to go away and make it simple again. Really, truly, aren't we, Tabitha?
Sorry, yes. I was enthusiastically saying yes to a muted microphone. I'll go away again now.
Just a bit, Stephen, your point about the benchmarking, I think it's quite important that obviously benchmarking student to students across institutions is something that's really, really important and people see as value. But benchmarking across different professional services, I can see the point there that then people may seem less used to it because it's so varied. I think we need to keep that in mind. It's a different thing from students and even teaching staff. I think it's such a varied experience, professional services within institutions. We have to recognize that, as you say, Stephen, comparing within the institution against different areas of professional services may be more valuable.
I've just unmuted myself. Can you hear me, Mark?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Yes, one of the reasons I mentioned that is that even within my own institution, we have a job role entitled online course developer, and they do a huge variety of different things. So even benchmarking within my institution on a particular role would be impossible.
Yeah.
And I'm struck by when I talk to my colleagues in other institutions, just the vast range of things we do. And perhaps there isn't that taxonomy that we need yet to allow this to happen.
Yeah. I think this should be the ability to the benchmark, but I don't think we should overvalue it either and understand what people's needs are. We're dealing with something here quite difficult to get a handle on. Do you think, Helen?
Well, I think exactly. Let's try and make this job interesting since we're here. I totally agree. I think this is, and I think Marika and Gillian have put their finger on it. It is complex, and also Rob, it's complex to define what it is we mean, but it would be really nice to have a go at it. And Tabitha said, well, maybe work. I mean, I've offered one component of this, and I think I like that inspiration from Marika, that it's what is transferable perhaps across roles within professional services. And I think being a good provider of services to people who only access you digitally, so there must be a shorthand way of saying that, someone help me, that seems very transferable, but it's also goes well beyond using digital systems. It's clearly a professional attitude, mindset, practice, which we could ask people about, and we could ask them how they do that, and then we could ask them a bit about how they felt supported to do it. But are there other things that library staff, career staff, you know, accessibility staff, and then the non-student facing staff are doing that is different in the digital organisation that they have in common that we could be asking them about?
Helen, I think that, you know, we posed, you know, some fairly complex questions at the start when we did our teaching survey and we did our student survey. And in some respects, I think, you know, we need to start somewhere with this. And it's only through piloting this initial version that I think some of these answers will become clearer once we do see how, you know, how people respond, how it works within the different contexts within colleges and universities, and, you know, the sense of value that we then get out from the data. So in some respects, some of, you know, I think what we've found today is some really valuable inputs, but there are still some unanswered questions, which I think we probably will only perhaps get a little bit closer to answering once we've actually been through this cycle.
Hi, so yeah, I think that I feel that's really true with issues like the list of systems we ask about, for example. I feel really confident that will sort of evolve and fall out from the pilot process. And you're right that the teaching, you know, the teaching staff survey, we went through this same process of asking quite challenging questions of ourselves and of the goals. I don't tend to find, and this is the great value of having such an expert panel, I don't tend to find that the pilot process pushes you to ask more of those horizon. I mean, somebody said, and I'm sorry I've lost it, we really want to be more aspirational in what we ask about.
Yes.
I don't think the pilot process does that. I think the pilot process asks you to converge on a kind of some common ground. And I think what we found with the student survey was that, you know, actually we needed to push to get some questions in there that there wasn't a high demand for, but we have found to be over time exactly the right questions to have asked. And that's also what we should be doing here is asking what is the aspiration for our staff, not just that they're proficient users today, but, you know, in 4 or 5 years time, how should they be able to really contribute to the digital organisation they're in? How should they be able to contribute to their own professional development and career advancement and move across roles? And it may be this thing about providing services digitally is the one thing we can hang on to, and we should put that in and just see how people run with it and if people understand it. And then be satisfied with that. But I'd love for people here to go away and just mull over if there's anything other than that we could put in, because I totally agree, Sarah. I think some things will fall out from piloting, but I don't think the really difficult horizon.
Yes, yeah, great.
We have to push and challenge ourselves to find those.
And I think it's very much picked up on some of the themes that we had at DigiFest. And I know, you know, there's some comments in there about Ross and his presentation. I think it is, you know, it's that aspiration, it's that those, what was really interesting, I think one of the things I took away, that it was also trying to challenge us to think about how we develop those human capabilities, this is in relation to students, but thinking about empathy, accountability, creativity. You know, and I think a lot of what we tend to focus on, get bogged down on, are the actual uses, but actually what we want to be aspiring to is actually how we start to think about more of those transferable skills and those skills that will then enable them to be those digital professionals that, you know, that we've had the comment on. Impact, yes, yeah, great, Gillian. Yes, so no, I absolutely, I think we have a role in challenging, Helen, and I think we have a role in being more aspirational, and I think that this is some of the value work that we're doing is trying to also, through the expert panel, through this work, try to move the sector forward as well with its practice.
I think that's been really helpful. Steve, response to you about, sorry, someone's got the mic open. I don't know who it is.
Shall I just mute everyone again and then go back?
Yes.
Okay. Muting all.
Thank you. Phew. That sounds better. So some really good ideas there. The one about flexible working, I think, is one we can really work on actually and run with. The one about asking open questions, we could do that. I mean, if you know, we already hear back that open questions are a nightmare to analyse, and I think they're a nightmare for, you know, they're not a nightmare. They're fascinating, very very interesting, and an absolute joy to analyse. But they are quite time consuming to analyse for us, and certainly for institutions as well. Thank you. Yes, Tabitha. So. I think what we try and do is ask very targeted open questions, but there is a thing, again, it comes back to that UX design. It's about where they're placed in relation to some other questions. So, you know, when we ask the question about how good your, you know, what one thing could the organisation change, if that comes after a series of questions that are only about the digital environment, then the only feedback you will get, absolutely guaranteed, will be about Wi-Fi and software updates. If you ask that question after a more probing set of closed questions about some of these issues we're trying to untangle now, about, you know, how you actually carry out your role, how you relate to the service users, how you work flexibly, how you develop yourself. If we ask the same open question at that point in the survey, we will get lots about Wi-Fi and software upgrades, but we will also get some, I would say, more interesting, that's a value judgment, some responses that deal with those deeper questions that we're trying to probe here. So I think it's about where we put those questions and how we structure the survey around them, as well as being about the actual questions we ask.
I think, Helen, just a last point on that. I think one of the things that we've found, haven't we, to date, is that those are then prompts for institutions to then dig deeper at an institutional level, like many of you have done with your survey data, is to then have some follow-up focus groups. But it almost gives some indicators of the sorts of interesting things that you do want to flag up and delve deeper in and have further conversations around. So, you know, I think that there is that balance, isn't there, to get. But it's just so exciting. And, you know, I just, having visited many of you and spoken to many of you, it is wonderful to see and to have your input, and, you know, to see how we can really sort of get the most value that we can from this. And I just want to add in throw in one last point around, do we, you know, are we expecting our leaders and managers to complete this? Because I think, you know, we've spoken about the different staff groups. And academic, you could argue that deans or, you know, heads of department could do that version. But are we going to challenge our more senior staff, perhaps in, you know, professional services, to also undertake this survey? Because it would be great if we could.
Thanks, Sarah. That's a really useful point. And I think it does also come back to my question about whether and how we partition out data from groups of staff that are very directly responsible for some of these things, because, you know, we're inviting staff to be critical, if they feel like it, of the provision that's being made, particularly in the digital environment and particularly in their own digital development. And so I, again, wonder, you know, I raise the concern, the slight concern about the credibility of that data if we mix in with staff who are very much at the receiving end of those things, responses from staff who are responsible for providing those things, whether because they're managers or IT staff, support staff, or providers of staff development in this space. You know, there's a sense in which we need to be careful to keep responses separate, not because we necessarily have the capacity to analyse them separately, because they might be quite small in number, but, you know, this may be something we deal with in our guidance rather than anything else. It may not be something we can deal with in our survey design. We constantly have to remember we have guidance as well as survey questions to use to direct people as to how these happen. But we just need to give a bit of thought to whether there are particular staff groups who currently, you know, might be the people who look at the findings from the teaching and student surveys, the ones who receive it on their desks and think, okay, now I have a steer as to what to do about, you know, my responsibilities for the digital environment, my responsibilities for teaching staff development, or whatever it is, my responsibilities for student skills. How appropriate is it to bundle their data up, which is what may end up happening to it in the professional staff survey, with that other data that they're actually tasked to respond to? Do you understand what I'm asking? And how do we deal with that? Do we deal with it? Do we need to? Is it such a small number it's really not relevant? I don't know if I've lost people or if the question is too difficult.
I can hear you, Helen, but I can't hear any more comments coming in.
I mean, it's not, it's not a killer question. It doesn't kill the survey.
Could you repeat the question again? Sorry, Helen.
Okay, so Sarah's saying we need to survey. We would want to think about surveying managers and leaders, which is a really good point. And this is the obvious survey to include them in if we're not going to have a sort of separate survey. I think we might want a separate category for leaders and managers. That's fine. My concern is, though, that there are several groups of staff here. Managers may be one. People responsible for supporting and maintaining and delivering the digital environment would be among them. People responsible for the student digital experience, and people responsible for supporting the digital skills of teaching staff. At the moment, those people are the recipients, really, of findings from the insights surveys. They sit at their desk and the findings arrive, and they are tasked to do something about this. People aren't happy, you have to do something about it. And I wonder how and whether it's appropriate to survey those people if their survey responses just get bundled straight back up into all of the survey respondents. That place where we say, how excellent is the digital environment, and they have 7 options. How appropriate is it for the same people who are responding to that to also be surveyed about it? It's a conundrum, because they have really useful and valuable things to say, and detailed and knowledgeable, but there's also that potential cynicism that they may not be responding as naive end users. They may have some stake in the game, and I'm just wondering how we acknowledge that, maybe in the guidance or maybe in partitioning out some of those people. Mark, I think if we just want to quickly capture, if we move on, whether anyone has any points about the specific points about the survey questions. We've got some great commentary from people on the PDF, and I'd really encourage everyone to do that in detail. But are there any questions or queries that people have, having looked through this, that they want to raise right now before they go?
Any particular questions or flow in relation to? You see Tabitha's comments here as well.
Yes, please do email us comments, and I'm sorry this has been quite a challenging high-level discussion, but I think it's actually been really, really useful. And hopefully when you go and look at the survey that we've done so far, if you haven't already, you will understand some of the issues we've been wrestling with in designing it as it is. So we really look forward to getting your more detailed comments. Thank you.
And just to say, if anyone wants to email me afterwards, if they have any sort of thoughts after this meeting, just drop us an email and I can pass it on to Helen and Tabitha. Okay. And just to say that our next expert group webinar is on the 2nd of April, 1 till 2, and you already have the Zoom link, but it's there as well. So thanks for everyone for taking the time out. I will send off this presentation plus a recording of this webinar as well. Helen, thanks a lot for taking the presentation. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
No, just to say thanks to everyone. Sorry it's gone on quite so long, and comments please, and we'll get back to you with a revised version of the actual. We'll be focusing on the questions from now on, so we'll get back to you with a revised version of that as soon as we can.
Okay, thanks everyone for taking the time out. It's really appreciated, and we'll be in touch soon. Okay, cheers, bye.